Pokemon has had several games, some of them are definitely better than others. However, no matter how good a game is, it's bound to have some controversies because of the internet. Here are the most controversial things in every single Pokemon generation. Pokemon Red and Blue were the first games in this series, so there wasn't anything insanely controversial at the start. Sure, there was the Psychic type being the most overpowered type a type has ever been in the history of the franchise, and the slew of Poison types. But that was basically about it, except for Lavender Town. Specifically the music. The music does sound pretty creepy, but it does make sense because Blue most likely buried his Raticate here, and there's a ghost of a freaking Marowak. Anyway, this creepy town caused something called Lavender Town Syndrome. Lavender Town Syndrome was an urban legend where a bunch of Japanese kids... Okay, how do I say this without getting demonetized? Decreased the population? They decreased the population because apparently the high-pitched noise freaked them out and they jumped to their deaths. Anyway, this was just a myth, and in my opinion the music isn't really that creepy. Here, I'll even play a little bit right now. See, nothing to worry about. Generation 1 also had slot machines in the game corner, which were removed in future games because it promoted child gambling and got them an MA rating in Europe. It's also probably why we haven't seen these games being ported to the Switch quite yet. Warning, the next section contains flashing lights, so skip to here if you're epileptic or you're prone to seizures. In the 30th episode of the Pokemon anime, Ash's friends go to a factory or something and they meet a bunch of Porygon. Pikachu, for whatever reason, attacks them, and for whatever reason the animators didn't think this out, because there are a bunch of bright lights which I'll show right now. This is your third warning. Ma'am, if your kid has a seizure, do not sue me. This is literally your third warning, and there's a warning in the description down below. So here we go. Anyway, this little incident caused more than 600 Japanese kids to be forced to go to a hospital. Luckily, nobody died from the episode, and Porygon was banned from the anime, even though it was Pikachu who caused the incident with his Thunder Shocks. Another Generation 1 anime controversy was Jinx. In the anime, Jinx used to look like this, and most people said it represented blackface. This was changed in later games as well as the anime. Similarly, Mr. Mime is also controversial because, well, look at this design. Another controversy is with Kadabra. Famous magician Uri Geller said that Pokemon was ripping him off. Uri then sued Nintendo, won, and banned Kadabra cards from being made until November 28th, 2020, where he apologized and allowed Kadabra cards to be printed again. Moving on to Generation 2, these games were far more tame compared to Kanto. In fact, after doing some research, the only two controversies I could find was the simple fact that there was a Celebi event that never got distributed and Whitney's Miltank. If you've ever played a Generation 2 game, you know this thing is a beast with Stomp and Attract, but other than that there was nothing severe. Good job, Game Freak. And I take that back because Generation 3 is filled with controversies. For example, Pokemon from the first two generations could no longer be traded to Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald due to the cartridge format. This means if you want a complete National Pokédex, you need the following: 2 Game Boy Advances and a copy of the following games: Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green. Think that's not enough? Well, you also need a GameCube, Pokemon Box, Pokemon Coliseum, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, and the proper hardware to do the trades. This cost a ton of money, not to mention time, because you needed to be able to complete 3 regional dexes in Emerald in order to obtain all 3 Johto starters. Generation 3 also had some very difficult puzzles in order to catch all the Regis. This included knowing how to read Braille and having Pokemon with specific moves and HMs being in certain slots of your party. Needless to say, there was no way for anybody to figure out how to get these Pokemon without the internet. Generation 3 also had some pretty controversial Pokemon designs, such as Lombre representing Mexican and Hispanic stereotypes, and certain Pokemon having weird designs. The worst by far is Gardevoir. I'm not gonna explain why, but don't go digging too deep on the internet. Same with these guys. Honestly, it's best to just move on. Pokemon Generation 4 was somewhat tame with a few notable controversies. However, before I tell you, make sure you leave your favorite controversy in the comments below, and while you're down there, you might as well subscribe to the channel. The first controversy in Generation 4 was how slow the games were, Diamond and Pearl in particular. They were incredibly slow, and saving took a whopping 45 seconds to do. The second was Munchlax. There's nothing wrong with Munchlax as a Pokemon, however its inclusion was a bit controversial. See, Diamond and Pearl introduced honey trees, when you slather a honey tree with honey and wait 8 real-world hours for an encounter. Unfortunately, Munchlax has a 1% chance of spawning, making it pretty rare. To make things even worse, there are only 15 trees where Munchlax spawns. What 15 trees? Well, it's completely randomized based on your save file, making Munchlax probably the rarest Pokemon ever. People call Barry impatient, well at least he had the patience to do this. The third was God, or Arceus. God has always been a pretty touchy topic in today's society, but when this God Pokemon was announced, many people were disappointed by its design. They thought a God Pokemon should be, well, more godly. Also, let's not forget the fact that they scrapped the Arceus event because too many kids were too stupid to get the Azure Flute to get Arceus. That's a pretty dumb reason because they made us read Braille and put Pokemon with certain moves in certain slots. Oh, but that's pretty easy, but getting some dumb flute is sort of impossible. Game Freak logic, I guess. Sinnoh had one more controversy in the form of Cynthia's Garchomp. This thing is notorious for sweeping teams and has become infamous in the community because it's one of the most difficult Pokemon to fight in this series' history. But those are all the controversies for Generation 4, which was probably the most tame region so far. On to Generation 5. Generation 5's biggest controversy was the fact that only Unova Pokemon could be used until the champion was beaten. This was super controversial at the time, but many fans came to love it later. At the time, Generation 5 was also considered to be the worst generation of Pokemon because of this. Black and White were also notorious for some bad Pokemon designs. There were 151 new Pokemon, the most out of any generation, so not all of them are going to be good. Particularly Trubbish and Vanillite, Pokemon based on trash and ice cream respectively. Many Pokemon fans said that Pokemon ran out of new ideas and the older Pokemon are better. There was also this region's legendary trio, the Forces of Nature. People said they looked more like buff men than Pokemon, leading them to be quite hated in the community even today. Thankfully, those were all the controversies until Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 hit the shelves on June 23, 2012. While these games are beloved by many Pokemon fans, they caused a debate due to Black and White 2 being sequels rather than third versions. Many Pokemon fans were upset, and I personally like this format because it allows for a new take on the region as opposed to basically playing through the same game with a few hours of extra content all over again. Unfortunately, both third versions and sequels are done, as Pokemon now makes DLC, which is equally as great in my opinion. Moving on to Generation 6, and man, these games are controversial. The biggest one was that the games are simply too easy, and that is true to an extent. Generation 6 introduced Mega Evolution, a mechanic missed by many. It gave Pokemon a new design and gave them increased stats. The problem was it made the game too easy, as the only two enemy trainers who used this mechanic was Lysander with a Mega Gyarados and Diantha with a Mega Gardevoir. This is the only region where the trainers in said region did not take advantage of their mechanic and could easily be swept. Generation 6 also introduced the experience share, which basically removed grinding and made things even easier. The other Generation 6 games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, removed the Game Corner and the Battle Frontier. They removed the Game Corner because, like I said, it promoted gambling and kids or something like that, and they removed the Battle Frontier for whatever reason and just replaced it with a statue. Well, I don't care for either, it disappointed many. Fortunately, we're done with Generation 6, and that's a relief because Generation 7 has even more controversies. Generation 7 also came with its own set of controversies like I mentioned before. The first was the games themselves. For starters, all gym leaders were replaced by totem Pokemon, which were not received by many. The second was the difficulty. Compared to X and Y, the difficulty skyrocketed significantly. In fact, these games are considered by many to be the hardest games in the series. They're so difficult that they're even considered to be on the same level as difficulty ROM hacks such as Renegade Platinum and Inclement Emerald. I personally don't think that's true, but many do. These games did get enhanced versions, and those were also extremely controversial because they barely changed things at all. It's like Game Freak dumped the ROM on the computer, changed like 5 things, and called it a day. There were also several controversial Pokemon as well. Primarina and Incineroar were very controversial simply because they look too masculine and feminine. I personally love these guys, and in fact I used the entire starter trio on my first playthrough of Ultra Sun. Toucan, the regional bird, was also pretty controversial because it looks like a regular toucan. I guess I could see it, but Toucanon is alright in my book. The final Pokemon to be controversial was the Yungoos line. When these Pokemon were announced, many people were calling him Donald Trump's Pokemon because of the hairdo. Trump himself is an extremely controversial figure here, at least in America, so that didn't help these games out at all. I know I've been saying the past couple of generations have been pretty controversial, but Generation 8 is objectively the most controversial generation of Pokemon. There are so many controversies, so let's get right into it. The first is objectively the biggest controversy in the history of the franchise, Dexit. If you didn't know, back in the Nintendo Treehouse in 2018, Game Freak said that there would be no national Dex as Game Freak needed the time to polish Pokemon models as well as the overworld. People were freaking out and the hashtag Dexit started, where players would boycott the game if Game Freak didn't add the national Dex. It didn't work and the game sold 25.9 million copies. This actually led to another controversy because the graphics and the models didn't look as polished as they should be. This yet again led to another controversy because there was nothing to do after beating the game and becoming the champion. There was a throwaway 5-hour post-game that has you fight some Dynamax Pokemon and catch the box legendary. Compared to other games, this post-game was pretty lackluster. Thankfully, we did get DLC, and that did add a bunch of post-game stuff, mainly Dynamax adventures, which are pretty fun. But we're not done yet, as we haven't talked about the Pokemon. The starter trio for this generation was extremely controversial, mainly in Teleon, because the Pokemon looked too humanoid and single-typed. Greedent was also seen as pretty controversial because it looked like if somebody took Scovit, overfed him, and then gave him a shot to mutate him. Then there was Applin, who's just an apple. This annoyed people because they thought it was another lazy Pokemon design, not seeing the design and name pun. Lastly, there were the fossils, and I mean, just look at them. No wonder they're so controversial. Think we're done with Generation 8? Nope, not even close. We still have 2 more games to go through. The second game was Legends Arceus, and that actually was perceived fairly well, albeit for some graphical problems that plagued this generation, but overall it was considered to be a breath of fresh air for many. Now you may have noticed I skipped Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which released a few months earlier. I haven't been talking about remakes that much because they either fixed or share the same controversies, but Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are something else. I could easily make a 10 to 15 minute video on the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl controversies if I wanted to, but I don't have that time, so I'm just going to summarize. The most major controversy was the art style. Many people's theory was that Game Freak needed to pump out Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet within the same year, so they handed the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl development to ILCA to make, and since they're a pretty small company, the best they could come up with is this. That said, the reasoning behind these graphics was to apparently replicate the original games. See, this worked in 2007, but not 2021 in my opinion. They also didn't add any Platinum content other than a couple of things. Most people thought that the Platinum Pokédex would be in the game, but instead they did a weird mix, and there's several Pokemon you can get before the League, but can't evolve until after. These Pokemon include Gliscor and Probopass, who need an item which is locked behind the post-game to evolve. This annoyed many people, including me. And then there were following Pokemon. Following Pokemon are a staple to Pokemon, and unfortunately Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl didn't stick the landing because the Pokemon were smaller than the player, and they were super slow to the point where it was just annoying. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl took more from Sword and Shield's following Pokemon than from Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where the Pokemon actually followed you closely. Then there was the Elite Four and Champion. Prior to the League, the game was fairly simple and easy, but when we get to the League, every Pokemon has great moves, a good helpful item, a helpful nature, and a maxed out stat. Cynthia's Pokemon are perfectly competitive, meaning that most of your team will not stand a chance against her at all. Also, let's not forget the glitches that can cause you to softlock your game and force you to restart Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl overall is a hell show, and I recommend you check out this video by M&J TV for more information. With that, we're up to the most modern game, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are pretty well perceived overall, albeit for a few things. The first is the National Dex being removed, though most people expected this and there wasn't that much of a controversy. And with 2 DLCs dropping later this year, this problem will basically be remedied as most of the Pokemon are going to be in the game anyway. The second problem, and the most biggest, is the graphics and glitches. There are several points in the game where the frame rate significantly drops, such as the Sunflora puzzle, and there are many glitches in the game that just trigger random cutscenes or Koraidon or Miraidon going all over the place. Other controversies include not having Pokemon Home compatibility until May when this was supposed to come out in January, as well as the Pokemon themselves, which people are saying that's the overall weakest generation of new Pokemon, which is pretty understandable. The last controversy I could think of was the fact that this game was promoted to be open world and you could fight the gym leaders in any order you wanted. This is true, but there's no level scaling in this game, and that's kind of a disappointment when people like Abby Potter implemented this feature in her ROM hack, Pokémon Emerald Rogue, which is a fantastic ROM hack. I totally recommend you check it out. I may or may not be making a video on this game soon, but it's a pretty big disappointment when just one person's able to do this highly requested feature, but an entire multi-million-dollar company isn't. And there we have it. I'm sure there were some controversies I missed, so let me know in the comments. If you're new here, subscribe as I try to upload a video every single week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.